The old yellow bus wheezed to a stop at the gates of Fort Jackson. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the dirty window and watched as soldiers in crisp uniforms marched in perfect lines across the training grounds. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but her eyes stayed steady. She had waited 4 long years for this moment. Sarah grabbed her worn green duffel bag from the overhead rack. The bag had belonged to her father once. The fabric was faded and there were small tears near the handles, but she refused to buy a new one. This bag had traveled with him to Afghanistan. It had come back without him. Now it would go wherever she went. As she stepped off the bus, Sarah felt the hot South Carolina sun hit her face. The air smelled like dust and sweat and something else she could not name. Fear, maybe, or hope. Around her, 20 other new recruits stumbled out of the bus looking just as lost as she felt inside. Most of the other recruits looked so young. 18 and 19-year-olds with baby faces and nervous giggles. Sarah was 22 and felt ancient compared to them. While they had been in high school going to parties and worrying about prom dates, she had been working double shifts at a diner and a grocery store. Every penny went toward her younger brother Miguel's medical bills. Miguel had been born with a heart condition that required expensive surgeries. Their mother worked as a housekeeper, but it was never enough. After their father died in Afghanistan when Sarah was 18, she became the second parent Miguel needed. She watched other kids her age go to college while she counted tips and worried about insurance payments. But Miguel was getting better now. The last surgery had been successful. The doctor said he would live a normal life. Finally, Sarah could think about her own dreams. She had always wanted to serve her country like her father had. Now she could. A massive man in a drill sergeant uniform appeared in front of the group. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall with shoulders like a linebacker. His name tag read Hayes, and his cold gray eyes swept over the new recruits like he was looking at insects. Sergeant Hayes' voice boomed across the courtyard. "Welcome to Fort Jackson, maggots. For the next 10 weeks, this is your home. I am your mother, your father, your best friend, and your worst nightmare all rolled into one ugly package. You will do what I say when I say it. You will not think. You will not question. You will only obey." Sarah stood perfectly still while Hayes continued his speech. She had heard stories about drill sergeants from her father. He had told her they were tough but fair. Their job was to break down civilians and build up soldiers. It was not personal. It was just the way things worked. But as the days passed, Sarah began to notice something that made her skin crawl. Hayes was not just tough. He was cruel, and he seemed to save his worst treatment for the female recruits. During the first week, Sarah watched Hayes make Jessica Williams do push-ups until she collapsed. Jessica was a tiny girl from Iowa who wanted to be a medic. She tried her best at everything, but she was not very strong. Hayes would stand over her screaming that women had no business in the army. He said she would get good soldiers killed with her weakness. Sarah wanted to help Jessica, but she forced herself to stay quiet. Her father had taught her that sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to act. Sometimes jumping in too early made things worse. Then there was Maria Santos from Texas. Maria was tough and smart and could run faster than half the male recruits. But Hayes found other ways to break her down. He would make her clean the latrines over and over, saying her work was not good enough. He would inspect her bunk and find imaginary problems. He seemed to enjoy watching the frustration build in her eyes. The other male recruits started to follow Hayes' lead. They began making jokes about the women being too weak for military life. They whispered that the female recruits would wash out before the end of basic training. Some of them seemed to think it was funny when Hayes targeted the women. Sarah kept her mouth shut and her head down. She did every exercise perfectly. She kept her bunk spotless. She followed every order without complaint. The other recruits began to think she was weak because she never stood up for the other women. They whispered that she was scared of Hayes just like everyone else, but Sarah was not scared. She was planning. Every night after lights out, Sarah would lie in her narrow bunk and remember her father's stories. He had told her about the honor of serving, about protecting people who could not protect themselves, about standing up for what was right even when it was dangerous. Her father had also taught her how to fight. Not the kind of fighting that Hayes taught them in combat training. Real fighting. The kind that could stop a man twice her size before he knew what hit him. Her father had been worried about her walking home alone from work. He wanted her to be able to defend herself. Sarah had practiced those moves thousands of times in the garage behind their house. She had taken martial arts classes when she could afford them. She was not the helpless girl that Hayes thought she was. None of the recruits knew what she was capable of. She watched Hayes carefully during training. She studied the way he moved and the way he thought. She learned his patterns and his weaknesses. She waited for him to make a mistake. She waited for the moment when his cruelty would go too far. Sarah knew that moment would come soon. Men like Hayes always pushed too hard eventually. They could not help themselves. And when that moment came, she would be ready. The other recruits had no idea that the quiet girl who never caused trouble was actually the most dangerous person in their platoon. Sarah Martinez was her father's daughter. She had his patience and his tactical mind. She had his sense of justice and his protective instincts. Most importantly, she had his training and his fighting skills. Hayes was about to learn that the hard way. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah arrived at Fort Jackson, and Sergeant Hayes was getting worse. Every morning brought new cruelty, and every evening left the female recruits more broken than before. Sarah watched it all with growing anger burning in her chest like a fire that refused to die. Hayes had decided that Jessica Williams was his favorite target. The small girl from Iowa tried harder than anyone else, but her body just could not keep up with the demands of military training. She was too light to carry the heavy packs, too short to climb the tall obstacles, too gentle for the aggressive combat drills. This morning, Hayes made Jessica repeat the obstacle course 6 times while the other recruits stood in formation watching. Each time she failed to complete it fast enough, he would scream at her. His voice echoed across the training ground like thunder. "You are pathetic, Williams," he shouted as Jessica struggled to climb over a wooden wall. "My grandmother could move faster than you, and she has been dead for 10 years. You are going to get real soldiers killed with your weakness." Jessica fell from the wall and landed hard on her back. Sarah could see tears mixing with the dirt on the girl's face. But Jessica got up and tried again. She always tried again. That was what Hayes hated most about her. She never quit, no matter how much he hurt her. After the obstacle course, Hayes moved the platoon to weapons training. Sarah was good with rifles. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12. She could hit targets that some of the male recruits missed completely, but she was careful not to show off. She hit just enough targets to pass without drawing attention to herself. Hayes walked up and down the firing line looking for someone to pick on. His boots made sharp sounds on the concrete as he moved. Sarah could feel him getting closer to her position. She kept her breathing steady and her hands calm on the rifle. But Hayes stopped behind Maria Santos instead. Maria was from a tough neighborhood in Houston, and she did not back down from anyone. That made her dangerous in Hayes' eyes. Strong women were threats to his power. They had to be broken completely, or they would cause problems later. "Your stance is all wrong," Santos Hayes barked. "You shoot like a little girl playing with toys. No wonder you cannot hit anything important." Maria's jaw tightened, but she did not respond. She had learned that talking back only made things worse. Sarah admired Maria's self-control, but she could see the anger building behind her dark eyes. Everyone had a breaking point. Even the strongest people could only take so much abuse. That afternoon brought combat training in the mud pit behind the barracks. The recruits had to practice hand-to-hand fighting techniques while crawling through thick, sticky mud. Hayes loved these sessions because they gave him more chances to humiliate the women. He paired Jessica with one of the biggest male recruits for a wrestling drill. The boy was twice her size and felt bad about having to fight her, but Hayes stood over them screaming orders until the boy had no choice but to follow commands. "Throw her down," Hayes yelled. "Show her what real strength looks like. Make her understand that she does not belong here." Jessica tried to defend herself, but she was overpowered in seconds. She hit the mud face first and came up spitting dirt. Hayes made them repeat the drill 5 more times. Each time Jessica lost. Each time she got up covered in more mud and looking more defeated. Sarah felt her hands shake with rage as she watched. This was not training. This was torture. Hayes was using his power to destroy a young woman who only wanted to serve her country. Her father would have been disgusted by this behavior. The breaking point came during the final drill of the day. Hayes had saved the worst for last. He called it the gauntlet. Recruits had to army crawl under barbed wire while other recruits threw muddy water at them. It was supposed to simulate combat conditions, but Hayes used it as another way to break down the women. Private Johnson was the youngest female recruit at 19 years old. She had joined the army to pay for college and help her single mother back home. Johnson was shy and scared, but she worked hard and never complained. That made her perfect prey for Hayes. Johnson started crawling under the wire, but she was moving too slowly for Hayes' liking. He began yelling at her to move faster. When she did not speed up enough, he grabbed her by the back of her uniform and dragged her forward. The barbed wire caught her sleeve and tore it. "Move faster, you worthless piece of garbage," Hayes screamed. "You think the enemy is going to wait for you to figure out how to crawl. You think they care that you are scared." Johnson tried to move quicker, but panic was setting in. She got tangled in the wire and could not move forward or backward. Hayes lost what little patience he had left. He grabbed Johnson by the hair and shoved her face down into the muddy ground. "You want to quit?" he yelled while holding her head in the mud. "You want to go home to mommy and cry about how mean the army is? Say it. Say you quit and I will let you up." Johnson could not breathe with her face pressed into the thick mud. She struggled and tried to lift her head, but Hayes was too strong. The other recruits watched in horror as the girl began to panic. This had gone beyond training. This was assault. Sarah felt something snap inside her mind like a wire pulled too tight. Every lesson her father had taught her about honor and protecting others came rushing back. Every story about good soldiers standing up for their fellow troops echoed in her ears. She had promised herself she would stay invisible. She had planned to graduate quietly without causing trouble. But watching Hayes abuse his power over someone so young and helpless reminded her that some things were more important than personal safety. Her father had died protecting his squad in Afghanistan. He had given his life because he believed some things were worth fighting for. Now Sarah faced her own moment of choice. She could stay quiet and safe, or she could stand up for what was right. The decision was easier than she expected. Sarah Martinez moved without thinking. 1 second she was standing in formation watching Private Johnson struggle in the mud. The next second she was walking toward Sergeant Hayes with purpose in every step. Her boots made soft sounds on the wet ground, but her heart was beating so loud she thought everyone could hear it. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah approached Hayes. She could see every detail with perfect clarity. The way his massive hands pressed Johnson's face deeper into the mud. The panic in the young girl's movements as she tried to breathe. The shocked faces of the other recruits who could not believe what they were witnessing. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her father had taught her to stay calm in dangerous situations. Panic got people killed, he always said. Clear thinking and quick action saved lives. Sarah's mind became sharp and focused like a blade ready to cut through the chaos. She reached Hayes and grabbed his thick wrist with her right hand. Her grip was firm and steady. Her voice cut through the morning air like steel. "That is enough, Sergeant," she said clearly. "Let her go." The entire training ground fell silent. 40 recruits stopped breathing at the same moment. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Nobody had ever spoken to Sergeant Hayes like that. Nobody had ever dared to touch him without permission. The silence stretched on and on like a wire about to snap. Hayes slowly turned his head to look at Sarah. His gray eyes were filled with disbelief and rage. For a moment he seemed frozen by shock. Then his face twisted into an expression of pure fury that made several recruits take steps backward. Johnson used the moment to pull her face out of the mud and gasp for air. She rolled away from Hayes and lay on her side, coughing up dirt and water. Sarah did not take her eyes off Hayes, but she felt relief that the girl was breathing again. "What did you just say to me, Martinez?" Hayes asked in a voice that was barely controlled. His words came out slow and dangerous like a snake preparing to strike. His free hand curled into a fist that looked like it could break bones. Sarah did not move away from him. She did not let go of his wrist. She looked directly into his angry eyes and spoke again with the same calm voice. "I said, let her go, Sergeant," she repeated. "This is not training anymore. This is abuse." The word abuse hung in the air between them like an accusation that could not be taken back. Hayes' face turned red with rage. No recruit had ever called him out like this. No woman had ever challenged his authority so directly. His reputation was built on fear and absolute control. Sarah was threatening everything he believed about himself. Hayes jerked his wrist free from Sarah's grip and turned to face her fully. At 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds, he towered above Sarah's smaller frame. He had 20 years of military experience and a reputation for breaking recruits who stepped out of line. He expected Sarah to shrink back in fear like all the others. Instead, Sarah stood perfectly still. Her feet were positioned exactly the way her father had taught her. Her weight was balanced and ready to move in any direction. Her hands hung loose at her sides, but her muscles were coiled tight like springs ready to release. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Martinez Hayes snarled. "You think because you have kept your mouth shut for 3 weeks that you are special. You are nothing. You are weak just like all the other females in this platoon." Hayes stepped closer to Sarah, trying to intimidate her with his size. His shadow fell across her face, but her expression never changed. She had faced bigger men than Hayes before. Size did not always determine the winner of a fight. Speed and skill could overcome strength if used correctly. "Let me show you what happens to recruits who forget their place," Hayes said with a cruel smile. He reached out with both hands to grab Sarah by the throat. This was his favorite intimidation technique. Lift them off the ground and watch them panic. It worked every time. But Sarah was not like the other recruits Hayes had terrorized. The moment his hands moved toward her neck, she reacted with lightning speed that shocked everyone watching. Her left hand swept up to block his grab while her right hand struck at a pressure point on his wrist that her father had shown her years ago. The technique was called a nerve strike, and it worked perfectly. Pain shot up Hayes' arm like electricity, making his fingers go numb. His grab failed completely and he stumbled backward with surprise written all over his face. He had never encountered a recruit who could fight back like that. Sarah moved smoothly into a defensive stance that her father would have recognized immediately. It was a combat position designed for close quarters fighting. Her hands were up and ready. Her feet were planted firmly on the ground. Her eyes never left Hayes' face as she prepared for his next move. The other recruits watched in stunned amazement. Their quiet teammate who never caused trouble had just defended herself against Sergeant Hayes. She had broken his grip like it was nothing. She had made the most feared drill sergeant on the base look foolish in front of everyone. Hayes stared at Sarah with new eyes. He suddenly realized that he had completely underestimated her. The way she moved was not the clumsy flailing of an untrained civilian. It was the precise, fluid motion of someone who had been taught to fight by an expert. Her defensive stance was textbook perfect. Her timing had been flawless. "Who are you?" Hayes asked quietly. The rage in his voice was replaced by curiosity, and something that might have been respect. "Where did you learn to move like that, Martinez?" Sarah kept her hands up, but her voice remained calm and steady when she answered. "My father taught me, Sergeant," she said simply. "He believed that true strength comes from protecting others, not from hurting them." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine at those words. Something about the way Sarah said them reminded him of the combat veterans he had served with overseas. The quiet confidence, the absolute certainty, the willingness to face danger without flinching. For the first time in his career, Sergeant Hayes wondered if he had picked a fight with the wrong recruit. The training ground remained frozen in time as Hayes and Sarah stared at each other. 40 recruits held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Private Johnson had crawled away from the confrontation and was cleaning mud from her face with shaking hands. The morning sun beat down on everyone, but nobody moved a muscle. Hayes flexed his fingers, trying to get the feeling back in his right hand. The nerve strike Sarah had used was precise and effective. It was not something a civilian would know how to do. It was not something you learned from watching movies or taking a self-defense class at the local gym. That kind of technique came from serious military training. His mind raced as he studied Sarah more carefully than he ever had before. She stood perfectly balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. Her hands were positioned to block or strike depending on what he did next. Her breathing was controlled and steady despite what had just happened. Everything about her posture screamed professional training. "Where exactly did your father serve?" Martinez Hayes asked in a voice that had lost most of its anger. His drill sergeant mask was slipping and genuine curiosity was taking its place. "The way you move tells me he was not just some weekend warrior playing soldier." Sarah kept her defensive stance, but she could hear the change in Hayes' tone. He was no longer trying to intimidate her. He was asking real questions, like one soldier talking to another. She decided to answer him honestly. "Gunnery Sergeant Roberto Martinez," she said clearly, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan before he was killed in action 5 years ago. The name hit Hayes like a physical blow to the chest. He actually took a step backward and his face went pale under his tan. Roberto Martinez was a legend in Marine circles. Hayes had heard stories about the man even though they had never served together. Martinez had been known for his tactical brilliance and his absolute dedication to protecting his troops. Hayes remembered hearing about Martinez's death through the military network. An IED had taken out most of his squad during a patrol in Helmand province. Martinez had stayed behind to cover the evacuation of his wounded men. He had held off enemy fighters until a rescue helicopter could get his people to safety. He died saving 6 other Marines who all went home to their families. The other recruits did not understand what was happening, but they could see the change in Sergeant Hayes' expression. The cruel drill instructor was being replaced by someone else, someone who looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect. Hayes lowered his hands completely and stood at a more relaxed position. His voice became quiet and serious when he spoke again. "Roberto Martinez was your father," he said, more as a statement than a question. "I heard about what happened to him in Afghanistan. He died a hero, Martinez. Every Marine knows that story." Sarah felt tears threaten to fill her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough over her father's death. Today was about standing up for what he had taught her. Today was about honoring his memory by protecting someone who needed help. "He taught me that being strong meant protecting people who could not protect themselves," she said. "He taught me that real soldiers do not use their power to hurt innocent people. They use it to defend those who need defending." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond the current situation. Hayes understood exactly what Sarah was saying. She was not just talking about Private Johnson. She was talking about Jessica Williams and Maria Santos and all the other female recruits he had been tormenting for weeks. Hayes looked around at the faces watching him. For the first time, he really saw the fear in the eyes of the female recruits. He saw the way they flinched when he got close to them. He saw how they tried to make themselves invisible during training. He realized that somewhere along the way he had stopped being an instructor and become a bully. The revelation was uncomfortable and painful. Hayes had convinced himself that he was just being tough. He told himself that military training was supposed to be hard. But looking at Sarah's steady gaze, he could see the truth reflected back at him. He had been using his position to hurt people who could not fight back. Hayes thought about his own military training 20 years ago. His drill instructors had been tough, but they had also been fair. They pushed recruits to their limits, but they did not humiliate them or break them down for personal pleasure. They built soldiers instead of destroying spirits. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out on Hayes' face. She had made her point and proven she could defend herself. Now she needed to give him a way to change course without losing face, completely in front of the other recruits. "My father always said that good leaders admit their mistakes and try to do better," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "He said that real strength comes from building people up, not tearing them down." Hayes understood the lifeline Sarah was offering him. She was giving him a chance to be better than he had been. She was showing him a path back to the kind of leader he had wanted to be when he first became a drill sergeant. The silence stretched on as Hayes made his decision. Around them, the other recruits waited to see which direction this confrontation would go. Would Hayes double down on his cruelty, or would he find a way to change? The next few moments would determine not just Sarah's future, but the future of everyone in the platoon. Hayes slowly nodded his head and took another step back from Sarah. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone that none of the recruits had heard from him before. It was the voice of a leader instead of a tyrant. "Stand down, Martinez," he said formally. "Return to formation." Sarah lowered her hands and relaxed her stance, but she did not take her eyes off Hayes until she was sure the confrontation was really over. She had won this battle, but she knew the real test would be what happened next. Would Hayes learn from this moment, or would he find ways to punish her later when no one was watching? Only time would tell if Sergeant Hayes was capable of becoming the leader these recruits deserved. The days following the confrontation brought changes that nobody at Fort Jackson could have predicted. Sergeant Hayes walked differently now. He spoke differently, too. The cruel edge in his voice had been replaced by something that sounded more like actual leadership. The female recruits noticed it first because they had been his primary targets for so long. Hayes no longer screamed insults at Jessica Williams when she struggled with the obstacle course. Instead, he would walk beside her and give her tips on how to climb the walls more efficiently. He showed her how to use her legs instead of just her arms. He taught her breathing techniques that helped her conserve energy during long runs. Jessica could not believe the change at first. She kept waiting for the trap or the cruel joke that would bring back the old Hayes. But as days passed, she began to trust that this transformation was real. For the first time since arriving at Fort Jackson, she felt like she might actually make it through basic training. Maria Santos was suspicious of the changes for longer than anyone else. She had grown up in tough neighborhoods where people did not change overnight. She watched Hayes carefully during training sessions, looking for signs that he was just pretending to be different. But even Maria had to admit that his new approach was working better than his old methods. The entire platoon was performing better under Hayes' new leadership style. Instead of breaking people down with fear and humiliation, he was building them up with proper instruction and encouragement. The recruits worked harder because they wanted to succeed, rather than because they were afraid of punishment. Sarah became an unofficial leader among the new soldiers without ever asking for the position. The other recruits began coming to her for advice about training and military life. They respected her not just because she had stood up to Hayes, but because she had done it for the right reasons. She had risked everything to protect someone else. In the evenings, after official training was over, Sarah would teach the other female recruits some of the techniques her father had shown her. She showed them basic self-defense moves that could help them feel more confident. She taught them about situational awareness and how to project strength even when they felt scared. Hayes noticed these informal training sessions, but he did not try to stop them. In fact, he sometimes watched from a distance with what looked like approval on his face. He seemed to understand that Sarah was doing exactly what a good leader should do. She was helping her fellow soldiers become stronger and more capable. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Hayes did something that shocked everyone in the platoon. During morning inspection, he called Sarah forward in front of all the other recruits. Everyone expected some kind of delayed punishment for her actions. Even Sarah prepared herself for whatever consequences Hayes had planned. Instead, Hayes spoke to the entire platoon in a clear, strong voice that carried across the courtyard. "Recruits," he said, "I want you to look at Private Martinez. 3 weeks ago, she did something that took more courage than anything I have seen in 20 years of military service. She stood up for a fellow soldier who was in trouble. She put herself at risk to protect someone else. That is what real soldiers do." The other recruits looked at Sarah with new understanding. They finally grasped why she had stayed quiet for so long. She had not been weak or scared. She had been waiting for the right moment to act. When that moment came, she had been ready to do whatever was necessary. Hayes continued his speech, with words that would stay with the recruits for the rest of their military careers. "The Army teaches us about honor and duty and service," he said. "But sometimes we forget what those words really mean. Private Martinez reminded me that our job is not to break people down. Our job is to build them up. Our job is to create soldiers who will protect each other and serve their country with pride." He turned to look directly at Sarah as he spoke his next words. "Your father would be proud of you, Martinez," he said quietly. "You honor his memory every day by the way you treat your fellow soldiers. You understand what it really means to serve." Sarah felt tears threaten to fill her eyes, but she kept her military bearing. This public recognition meant more to her than any medal or award could have. Hayes was telling everyone that she had lived up to her father's example. There was no higher praise in her mind. The remaining weeks of basic training passed more smoothly than anyone had expected. Hayes had become the kind of instructor that recruits respected rather than feared. He pushed them hard, but he also supported them when they struggled. He built their confidence instead of destroying it. Jessica Williams not only completed basic training but graduated in the top half of her class. The skills Hayes taught her after changing his approach had made all the difference. She went on to medical training and eventually became the combat medic she had always dreamed of being. Maria Santos excelled in advanced combat training and was selected for special operations preparation. Her natural toughness combined with proper instruction made her one of the most capable soldiers in her graduating class. She never forgot that Sarah had helped create the environment that allowed her to succeed. Private Johnson recovered fully from her traumatic experience and became one of the strongest advocates for fair treatment in military training. She often told the story of how Sarah had saved her from serious harm and possibly even death that day in the mud. On graduation day, Sarah stood in formation, wearing her new uniform with pride. She thought about her father and how he had always talked about the honor of serving in the military. She thought about the oath she was about to take to protect and defend her country and its people. But most of all, she thought about the lesson she had learned at Fort Jackson. Sometimes the most important battles were not fought against foreign enemies. Sometimes they were fought right at home against injustice and cruelty and the abuse of power. Sarah Martinez had won such a battle. In doing so, she had honored her father's memory and proven that true strength came from protecting others. She had shown that one person willing to stand up for what was right could change everything. The shy recruit who had stepped off a bus 10 weeks earlier was gone. In her place stood a soldier ready to serve her country with honor. 2 years had passed since Sarah Martinez graduated from Fort Jackson, but her story had become legend throughout the military training system. New recruits arriving at basic training would hear whispered tales about the quiet girl who had stood up to the meanest drill sergeant on base and changed everything. The story grew with each telling, but the core message remained the same. One person could make a difference if they had the courage to act. Sarah was now stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, serving with the 82nd Airborne Division. She had earned her jump wings and completed advanced combat training with honors. Her fellow soldiers respected her not just for her skills but for her character. She had a reputation as someone who would always have your back when things got dangerous. On this particular morning, Sarah was leading a training exercise for new paratroopers. She watched the nervous faces of the young soldiers preparing for their first jump and remembered her own fears when she had started jump school. The key was building confidence through proper preparation and support from experienced teammates. Among the new soldiers was a young man named Private Torres who reminded Sarah of herself when she had first arrived at basic training. He was older than the other recruits and carried himself with quiet determination. Sarah had noticed him watching the training carefully and asking thoughtful questions. There was something about him that made her think he had his own story to tell. After the morning briefing, Sarah approached Torres while the other soldiers were checking their equipment. She had learned to trust her instincts about people, and something told her this young man might need extra guidance. "How are you feeling about your first jump, Torres?" she asked in a friendly voice. "Most people are nervous their first time up. It is completely normal." Torres looked surprised that someone of Sarah's rank was taking time to talk with him personally. He had heard stories about Sergeant Martinez and her reputation as a fair but demanding leader. Other soldiers had told him that she would help anyone who worked hard and showed respect for their teammates. "I am nervous," Sergeant Torres admitted honestly. "But I am more worried about letting my team down than I am about the jump itself. I have a lot of people counting on me to succeed here." Sarah nodded with understanding. She could see the weight of responsibility in Torres' eyes, and it reminded her of the pressure she had felt to honor her father's memory. Sometimes carrying other people's expectations could be harder than facing physical danger. "Tell me about those people who are counting on you," she said as they walked toward the aircraft hangar. Sometimes talking about your motivation helps calm the nerves before a big challenge. Torres was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust Sarah with his story. Finally, he began to speak in a voice filled with emotion he was trying to control. "My little sister was killed in a car accident 2 years ago," he said quietly. "She was only 16 and she wanted to be a teacher. The drunk driver who hit her got away with barely any jail time because his family had money and good lawyers. I joined the Army because I want to be someone who protects innocent people from predators who think they can hurt others without consequences." Sarah felt her heart tighten with sympathy for Torres. She understood the pain of losing family members and the drive to turn that loss into something meaningful. His motivation reminded her of her own journey from grief to purpose. "Your sister would be proud of the man you are becoming," she told him with genuine warmth. "The fact that you are here trying to become someone who protects others shows that her memory is inspiring you to do good things in the world." As they reached the hangar, Sarah could see that her words had helped Torres find some peace about his upcoming jump. His shoulders were straighter and his breathing had become more relaxed. Sometimes all people needed was someone to acknowledge their struggles and validate their goals. The jump training went perfectly that day. Torres performed every exercise with skill and confidence that impressed the instructors. Sarah watched him help other nervous soldiers prepare their equipment and encourage them before they boarded the aircraft. He was already showing the leadership qualities that would make him a valuable member of any military unit. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change the direction of her military career. Colonel Williams was calling from the training command at Fort Jackson. Sarah recognized the name immediately because Colonel Williams had been Captain Williams when Sarah was in basic training. She had been promoted and given command of the entire training facility. Sergeant Martinez, Colonel Williams said in a professional but warm voice, "I have a proposition for you that I think might interest you. We need experienced NCOs who can serve as drill instructors and help train the next generation of soldiers. Your reputation for developing young troops has gotten attention at the highest levels." Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the unexpected opportunity. Becoming a drill instructor would mean going back to Fort Jackson where her own transformation had begun. It would mean having the chance to shape new soldiers the way Sergeant Hayes had eventually shaped her platoon after he changed his approach. "I am honored by the offer, Colonel," she replied carefully. "Can you tell me more about what the position would involve?" Colonel Williams explained that the Army was implementing new training methods based on lessons learned from recent conflicts. They wanted drill instructors who could be tough and demanding, while also being supportive and encouraging. The old methods of breaking people down through fear and humiliation were being replaced with techniques that built confidence and teamwork. "We need leaders like you," Martinez, Colonel Williams continued. "People who understand that real strength comes from protecting others and building them up. Your story at Fort Jackson has become a teaching example in our leadership courses. We want you to help us create a new generation of drill instructors who lead by example instead of fear." Sarah thought about her father and the lessons he had taught her about service and leadership. She thought about Sergeant Hayes and how he had transformed from a bully into a respected instructor after learning what real leadership looked like. Most of all, she thought about all the young soldiers like Torres, who would benefit from having supportive leaders during their most vulnerable time in training. The decision was easier than she expected. "When do I start, Colonel?" she asked with determination in her voice. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of her first platoon of new recruits at Fort Jackson. She wore the same drill instructor hat that Sergeant Hayes had worn, but she carried herself with a different kind of authority. Her voice was firm but not cruel. Her expectations were high but achievable. Her goal was to build soldiers rather than break civilians. Among her new recruits was a quiet young woman who reminded Sarah of herself years earlier. The girl carried an old duffel bag and had the same determined look in her eyes that Sarah had possessed when she first arrived. Sarah made a mental note to keep an eye on that recruit and make sure she had the support she needed to succeed. The cycle was beginning again, but this time it would be different. This time the transformation would be built on respect rather than fear. This time every recruit would have the chance to become the soldier they were meant to be. Sarah Martinez had found her calling as a leader who built others up instead of tearing them down. Her father's legacy lived on in every soldier she would train and inspire.